Okay, this short video is called The Three Bedrock Principles. So in addition to coming up with those various dichotomies that help them decide First Amendment cases, the Supreme Court over time has also come up with these three bedrock principles that come into play in a lot of First Amendment cases. The First Amendment protection is not absolute. In other words, whenever people claim that their First Amendment rights, let's say their speech rights are being violated, one thing the court thinks about is this a case where there's an exception? And so, for example, we saw in the Schenck case, they came up with that idea of incitement. And they said incitement is a type of speech not protected by the First Amendment. So that's a perfect example of how the First Amendment protection is not absolute. We've seen this come up in the last year or so when there have been protests. And the protesters have done things like set fire to trash cans or broken windows. That is not protected by the First Amendment, right? Or setting a police cruiser on fire. That is definitely not protected by the First Amendment, right? So that's another example of how First Amendment protection is not absolute. I used the example of libel before earlier. That's another example, right? First Amendment protection, you can't just say or write anything without there possibly being consequences. The second one is really important, and this just came up in a very important Supreme Court case last week. First Amendment is not a shield against laws of general applicability. What's a law of general applicability? It's a law that is content neutral and it applies to everybody equally. Like, for example, traffic laws. You can't say, I ran the stop sign because my religion tells me I can run a stop sign. Come on, right? Laws of general applicability. So like all criminal laws and things like that are laws that apply to everybody equally. This came up in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case because that case was essentially all about this. Because what they were saying, what they wanted the court to say was, even though a non-discrimination law is a generally applicable law, and even though it applies to everybody, my religion should give me an exception to that law. And that's why that case was being watched. This doctrine has been around for many decades, and people were afraid, First Amendment scholars like me, were afraid that the court was going to undermine this idea. Because then suddenly you could have all sorts of people claiming, oh, my religion lets me out of this, and my religion. So for example, what about a Rastafarian who says, I have to smoke marijuana as part of my religion. Therefore, drug laws shouldn't apply to me. Well, Rastafarians have actually made that case in court. And the Supreme Court points to this and says, no, drug laws are generally applicable laws, and they apply to everybody. Another case just like it, Native Americans wanted to be allowed to smoke peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, as part of their religion. They made the argument, and the court recited this doctrine and said, no, drug laws are generally applicable, and you cannot have an exception. So, when the case finally came down in Masterpiece Cake Shop, the court was very careful not to abandon this. And Justice Kennedy has a whole paragraph in which he says, we are not abandoning this doctrine. Instead, they decided the case on very narrow legal grounds, and they sided in favor of the cake shop. And then finally, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institutional one. This one has been really, really important because of the rise of the internet. And what this is talking, a fundamental personal right, the reason it's in quotes, it's the strongest type of right because it is specifically mentioned in the Bill of Rights. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, those are specifically mentioned in the First Amendment, and so they are the strongest type of right. They are specifically mentioned. But the court has gone on to say in the Lavelle v. Griffin case of 1936, this is a fundamental personal right that applies to everybody, not just people who are professional journalists. So I enjoy freedom of the press, you enjoy freedom of the press. Whenever any of us is doing journalistic activity, like writing a blog, for example, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right that applies to each and every one of you when, for example, you're writing your blog. a writer, or for me if I was writing a blog. This has become really important in the internet age because we have a lot of, quote unquote citizen journalists, people who don't work for a newspaper or a radio station or a television station or website. Maybe they're doing it at home on their own. Freedom of the press applies to them just as much. We're all journalists when we're doing journalistic activity.